Hello, everybody, and welcome to the fashion seminar of Fashion in Helsinki 2021. In these discussions that I'm moderating, we're reflecting on inclusivity and marginalized identities in fashion design. My name is Ervin Latimer. I'm a fashion designer, writer, and managing editor of Ruskeat, Tytöt, Finland's first for people of color, by people of color media. And with me to discuss this topic today is, I promised myself I wouldn't say this, but honestly, one of my favorite designers, Martine Rose. Welcome.
Thank you.
I really tried not to geek out. I'm sorry.
That's very kind. I'm flattered. Thanks.
How are you and where are you now?
Oh, I'm great. Thanks. I'm actually in central London. I've just come from another meeting, sitting outside a cafe, which is exciting because they've just all opened again.
Oh, that's exciting.
It is exciting. It's nice to see the city coming back to life a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like going towards normality, I guess.
Exactly. We're heading there.
Exactly. Slowly but surely.
Yeah.
So in these discussions that I've had with various designers, we're talking about inclusivity and representation, words that luckily are more common in the industry at large now. But you started your namesake label in 2007. So you've been in the industry for almost 15 years.
Yeah.
Congrats, first of all.
Thank you.
And I'm curious, how does it feel to see that shift, to see that change in the common discussion? And I'm not asking you to share trauma, just how seeing that shift in vocabulary in everything, the way that we talk about these things.
I mean, there's been an enormous shift in the past 15 years. I mean, I can't really believe it's been 15 years. But yeah, when I started, I mean, I'm a Black woman designing men's clothes. So when I started, even menswear itself wasn't really a thing, let alone a woman designing menswear, let alone a Black woman designing menswear. So exactly. I was sort of a very, very niche thing. I mean, to be accurate, there were a few men's, we were a little sort of a community in London, small people doing menswear, but I think I was one of the only women at the time anyway. So yeah, to come from there to 15 years later, it's absolutely enormous shifts, but it's obviously it was where it needed to be. I mean, personally, I've always been my interest in fashion and culture has always been inspired by people that are on the outskirts and the periphery. Anyway, so my designs and my inspiration has always sort of followed that. I've always been interested in sort of shining a light on the the sort of shadows or whatever, the people that are less visible. So it's exciting and optimistic that now it just feels like there's more of a platform for people.
Exactly. And I think it's interesting. Often I think designers who sort of come from the margins or from the shadows, as you say, I think often there is, at least I've noticed that in my design work, that often there's you kind of want to uplift your community while you're doing that. And I think that's always interesting with, for example, me as a brown queer person. I've noticed that it's not just about me, it's just making sure that other people like me or other people who are even more marginalized than me have
absolutely. I mean that's it. When you talk about sort of trauma, I mean I have to be very careful when I speak about those things for me personally, because I don't feel traumatized, and I have to recognize that there are people that are way more traumatized than I, than my experiences. So it's absolutely to your point, it's not about pulling up the, getting somewhere and pulling up the ladder so no one else. It's about opening a door and saying, you know what I mean? Come,
exactly.
and yeah, I guess just being supportive, exactly, and uplifting your community. And there's also a fine line of like where you making sure that where you take inspiration from, you're also giving back. You know what I mean? It's not about hijacking
Exactly.
inspiration from communities and people and groups and sort of then shutting the door.
Yeah, I
It's
know.
really important.
I know exactly what you mean.
Sorry.
I think no worries. So sorry, didn't mean to cut you out. And I think
Not at all.
it's a fascinating point that you bring, because often this sort of thin line between appreciation and appropriation. Like I think,
Absolutely.
I mean, I can only speak for myself, but often I feel like there's when you understand that position of not usually being in power or representing someone who is not usually in power,
Exactly.
you tend to understand the importance of like making it, being very careful and making it like having the right people working on things, hiring, making sure that it's not just about who's in front of the camera as a model, but it's also about who's behind the camera, who's making decisions, etc.
Absolutely. And it can be sometimes, there are so many buzzwords at the moment in fashion, community, diversity, all of those things. And sometimes it's so hollow, and I think that really is the danger that we're in now. It's like, it's amazing that there's visibility, of course, on all of these and on people that we never ever saw, we only ever took from, actually.
Exactly.
So now of course there's like, finally they're more visible, but then it's like for using them again to fulfill a role. Do you see what I mean? To tick a box. I've done that. I've done that. I've drawn that dot from A to B, and that's now represented, so I can tick a box and like blah blah blah. And I think that's the danger zone that we're in now. That we're not just ticking boxes, and these sentiments are not hollow. That they're actually meaningful, lasting change, and that goes far beyond fashion. Far beyond.
Exactly.
That's systemic change.
Yeah, you can see I'm like nodding like crazy here.
Yeah.
when you're talking.
Yeah.
It's just like snapping my fingers, like
yeah. But, it is.
But that's also interesting, because I think the sort of ugly, I mean, again, fashion, it's a business, and often what sort of saddens me, that often it seems that, or many times it seems that, is the change, is it driven by will to change? Is it driven by will for equality, or is it driven by money? And sometimes it seems that because if there's an opportunity to make money, then you'll invite people in.
Yeah, absolutely. And it gets, exactly.
And it gets tricky because, you want to be appreciative of having those opportunities, but then again, it's about like, okay, but what is this for? And, why are these people here?
Absolutely. Yeah.
But obviously this relates to, like you said, like structures and like massive issues. But I want to also talk a little bit about your actual design work.
Yeah.
I was talking about this. I did another interview for this seminar with Bianca Saunders. I was talking with her about, there's this tradition of like, this is just me as a non-British person. I feel like there's this tradition of subversion in British fashion that I think I relate to, even if you just look at, everything from McQueen to Westwood and
you're right.
So
you're right. Yeah.
And I think you represent that in such a great way, this sort of quote unquote tradition of British fashion, and you bring such a unique, added layer to that.
Thank you.
And you're welcome. And I'm curious, did you want to make, in your designs, did you want to make points about Black masculinity specifically, or was it more that you wanted to work on masculinity at large, and then sort of naturally through you, Black implemented in that?
Exactly. I think it's definitely more that, it should be noted that I'm not a planner. I'm not a strategist. I didn't sort of start my label with any real intention other than it was like what I wanted to do, and I felt I had something to say. So I and it took loads of years of learning, making loads of mistakes and figuring out who I was, what I wanted to say. It takes time to do that. And so to your point, was it was I guess I always just wanted to be really authentic, and what I've always been interested in is masculinity as a whole, I would say. And through that sort of understanding and practice, different elements of masculinity have come into it. I think it's that I wanted to reflect the things that I always want to reflect, the things I see around me, the people I see around me, and sort of subvert it. I wanted it to be, I always want my clothes to be familiar, but then like new at the same time. So it's almost like you're looking at something so familiar, you get it, whether it's a check shirt, for example, you get it sort of feels familiar, but you're looking at it through a funhouse mirror,
Exactly. I think the perfect example of that is like your square toe loafers.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's like those things that were really culturally significant to me. So the square toe loafer, just to tell a bit of a story about that, I guess, as an example, is the reference for that is in London at one time there was you couldn't go to clubs they wouldn't let you in if you were wearing sportswear. So that's clubs of a certain time in the 90s, and that obviously, that tended to have sort of racist undertones, but that's another sort of story. There were these sort of door policies. Yeah, exactly. There were these sort of rigid door policies that meant that you couldn't go to a club in any sort of sportswear, trainers, caps, or anything like that. And so you had to go in shoes. And what it meant is that these that people just went out and bought really sort of like flashy Patrick Cox loafers, and they bought really, and that's when the whole sort of like Moschino, like all of that sort of came in this sort of like flamboyant
sort of maximalism,
sense of going into clubs. Exactly. Yeah. So that was a really informative point in my adolescence. I remember that. And so, yeah, exactly. The square toe loafer is in reference to that period, I guess.
Yeah, and also like I think it's such a great, because then my dad is American, but I was born in Finland, and I've lived all of my life, or most of my life, here. And being in Helsinki, for me personally, for example, the loafer has such a specific, as a shoe, as like an entity, it has such a specific sort of upper class charm to it for myself. So when I, for example, saw you doing it, it was like a shoe that I never imagined that I could wear. It just didn't feel.
Oh, interesting.
It didn't feel like it's something for me, because it was the richer blonde, blue-eyed
oh my God, that's so funny. Yeah, shoe. Exactly.
So when I saw you that, I was like,
oh, I can.
Part of my language, like, yes, I was like, it can be for me.
Oh yeah, that's true. It's true, because I guess it was subverted even before I did it. When the kids were wearing it to go to clubs, that they had already subverted it from the very sort of like upper class, like wearing it to work. Do you see what I mean? So it's actually been subverted several times before me.
And that's how you see it. That sort of naturally kind of through your work, these sort of new layers can be added, and things are given new meanings. And I think it's really,
exactly. Really yeah. I love that. Yeah.
You also, I was listening to an interview that you did, or like a podcast episode that you did for Matches Fashion, and you made a really interesting point about how in your design work that sort of gender fluidity and unisex approach doesn't appeal to you in the sense of like what you are designing. And that's not to say that, obviously we're all for like, the spectrum of gender. We all support that.
Of course, yeah.
In your design, could you just expand on that a little bit? Because I think it was a really interesting point you made.
Yeah, again, I guess going back to what we were saying earlier about these sort of buzzwords that you have to sort of like check these boxes, like, okay, yeah, community, gender fluidity, diversity, you know, and sometimes they feel very hollow and empty, you know, and you know, I feel like gender, this sort of like idea of like genderless clothes, the idea of gendered clothes is more, it's more interesting to me. Do you know what it's like? It's the subversion again, because it's a subversion, like men wearing women's clothes. I find it really sexy. I've always been interested in sex. Obviously, sex is like a really big part of what I do, and a big part of what most designers do, because it's there when you're talking about clothes, when you're talking about fashion, how you want to present yourselves. Also, clothes are really intimate. Clothes is like you wear them on your skin. It's what you want to show people. It's like it's all sort of like wrapped up in this intimacy and this sort of sexuality and sex. And I'm really interested in that. And that's a sort of a big motivation. And I feel that's what makes clothes playful, and that's how you are telling something, a story about yourself. You're showing what you want to show. And I just felt like genderless clothes takes all of the sex out of that. I'm like, what's genderless clothes? Like sex. There's nothing playful or sexy or sort of fun about it. And I guess for me anyway, personally, like the idea of men wearing women's clothes is really sexy. The idea of someone that doesn't have, you know, does not assign a gender, wearing, you know, being playful with clothes. Wearing male or female clothes is really sexy. For me, the notion of genderless clothes is like it doesn't resonate with me. Women wearing men's clothes is sexy.
Yeah, and also like,
and also just there's sorry to interrupt you. There's also just a massive part of clothes that are just they don't have a gender, but I wouldn't call them like denim, you know, jeans. They're not inherently gendered, but I wouldn't say that they're genderless either. Do you see what I mean? It's I don't know. I guess it's just a term that I find unappealing.
Yeah, and also like that's the sort of challenge here is that often it's sort of the discussion diverts to like semantics and like what.
Yeah, totally, exactly.
Because the point I think what you're making, which is really interesting, is that because no clothing has any gender really, and of course,
exactly.
ideally we wouldn't even care about men's or women's sections. It would be just about the body and what type of shape we want to dress. However, we're not there yet. There's still points to be made about the male body, about the female body, also about the, you know, bodies that don't identify either or somewhere in between. And I think it's important that it seems, especially in menswear, that if you apply so-called traditionally feminine elements, or if you do pieces like a dress, like you mentioned, that then it's gender fluid, and then it's like, you know, unisex, but like, no, like that's menswear, that's still masculinity. That's like important to keep in mind, that all of that, and then like in your work, when you add layers like Black masculinity and sort of like inherently what that means, you get really interesting you get into like really interesting things.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, our the camisole that we did last season or the season before for men, it was like a silky underwear camisole that was reversible. It sold out for men. I mean, you know, so you know, it's not actually it's not even a wild concept now that men are comfortable wearing this.
Thankfully. And that's sort
of like, great. It's sexy.
Exactly. And that sort of notion of like what a sexy man can look like, and what specifically can a sexy man of color, a sexy Black man, depending on the societies they're in, what can that image look like? And there's so much work to be done there that I think, it's important to make this differentiation. And of course, in no way are we saying here, you know, if one is a designer who doesn't apply any gender to their clothing, of course that doesn't matter. Like that's completely fine, and we need that too.
Exactly. I guess it's just I get, yeah, exactly. I'm definitely not saying that anyone that doesn't apply a gender to their clothes, or anyone that does do sort of like genderless clothing, it's you know, but for me personally, it's not you know, I don't connect with it myself.
Yeah, you know, and that's why I wanted to ask, because I think it's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
Maybe like my last sort of quick question, I'm curious.
Yeah.
You've done some really interesting collaborations with Nike, with the Italian brand Napapiri.
Yeah.
So thinking of these things that we mentioned or we've been talking about, have you been able to in those collaborations, have you been able to implement these ideas? Because there's such strong connotations to a brand like Nike, or even in, you know, Napapiri might be a bit more obscure to some people, but if you're in Italy, like it's, you know, everyone's wearing that, and it's very specific type of people that I think at least like when I was living there a couple of years ago, like young sort of masculine kids that are wearing
that. That's interesting. It's a really good question, and that's really interesting. Yeah, because I didn't know, before I started working with Napapiri, I didn't know who they were or anything, and they approached me and they were like, oh, you know, we're like teenagers wear it to school, and then like middle-aged men or like sort of dads wear it, and then like nothing in between. So that was sort of the challenge, was to sort of expand it beyond those groups. Have I managed to get some of the, you mean some of the conversations that I have within my own collections, have I managed to sort of infiltrate that into the white, some of the collaborations that I've done?
Maybe.
Yeah, I think so.
Because often at least I feel like if I'm like, when I think of like, oh, like if I could work with them, I would just bring this and this thing to the table. So I'm curious.
It's a really good question, and actually I've been so lucky with my collaborators. Mainly they come to me knowing, fully prepared, you know what I mean, and fully and really, really open. They don't come with a list of no's basically at all, in my experience, at all. And it's been a very, very organic, natural development as to what shape that collaboration should take, or that collection should take. Obviously the longer the collaborations go on, the more in depth it is, the bigger conversations you can have, and the more you can like represent. And sometimes, with Napa, it's taken different forms. It's been like who I've cast to do those, to do the campaigns. It's been where we've done those campaigns. It's, I guess, volume. It also has to have the brand DNA. I just can't come and just do my own, I wouldn't do silk camisoles, for example.
No. That wouldn't make also any sense.
Exactly. But I have to say, on the whole, like particularly with some of the stuff that will come out with Nike, you'll see more of these ideas of the gender being played with, definitely. But yeah, on the whole, like they've been really, I'm really careful who I collaborate with, and I, because it has to be a real exchange and a real conversation. And if there are if I just haven't had an experience yet where people sort of don't know what they're getting into a bit, and then they'll be like, oh no, that's too risky. That hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, not yet.
So,
but also
not yet.
Yeah, not yet. And then also, like, you have to, at least I've noticed, like, as a person of color, like when you enter those rooms, you know, in those spaces, you might be the only one. So like you have
I am always.
You have to be so you have to be, it's like a shame to say this, but sometimes I feel like you have to be also smart about like where you're banging your, like,
where you're banging your drum. Exactly.
To the table, exactly. And like, how do you like sort of trick them to like bring things in that they might not be prepared for, because they don't realize that they need to do that. So
exactly. But to be honest, like when I'm going back to your very, very first question, like when I started 15 years ago, no one was sort of talking about what I wanted to talk about. No one was doing, no one was doing the volumes, or no one was sort of like putting men in, the stuff that I was doing at the time. And it would have been much harder probably if I had collaborators at that time to have to do the things that I was doing. They would have been much more hesitant, obviously. But now really what I have been doing for the past sort of 15 years, everyone is talking about, you know what I mean? It's sort of it's in line with how the world has, you know what I mean, what the world deems sort of important now. So really, and you know, the corporations have caught up with that. You know, they don't want to be left behind. They want to be part of the conversation. They want to be relevant. And in order to be relevant, they need to be taking part in these conversations.
Absolutely.
You know.
Absolutely. That's actually, honestly, you kind of did my job for me. That's like a perfect wrap up for for what we talked about. Obviously, I mean, this was just like a kind of like a chat and a scratch in the surface. There's many like structural things,
so many things that we can,
things that we could talk about.
Exactly.
But I'm really glad that we were able to have this discussion. And
Me too.
I don't think often in fashion you don't often see professionals of color talking about these things amongst themselves, and that's sort of something that I'm hoping that would increase in the future, and was one of the goals for this seminar or this part of the seminar that I'm moderating. So I'm really thankful that you took time from your massively busy schedule at this.
Not at all. I'm really happy to have been invited. Thank you for having me. It's a great discussion.
Of course, my true pleasure. I mean, I don't even need to wish you luck because you're so good, but you know, all the best.
Thank you. To you too.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Take care. All the best. Take care. Bye.